Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the East Coast Hunt, Fish, Hike podcast. This is another short little encore episode. This one coming from our Three Things to Bring episode from season 1. As we move into summer months, it always makes me think of backpacking. This is a short highlight from that backpacking episode from season 1.
So, if outdoor adventures like Pat overpacking on his White Mountain excursion and finding a woodland stick to help him descend some treacherous terrain is your type of thing, you've come to the right place. And as always, if you haven't done so yet, make sure to follow us on Instagram at EC underscore hunt fish hike underscore pod and subscribe to the podcast to make sure that you don't miss an episode, recap, or clip.
All right. Thanks for following along, and remember to get outside. Have some fun out there. So this story is going to kind of go back to my first ever backpacking adventure. So a little bit of background, right? At this stage in my hiking career, I'd done some hikes. I've done some bigger hikes, some like 4,000 footer hikes in the White Mountains, which, to folks out west, 4,000 feet doesn't sound like it's all that high. And as true elevation wise, it's not, right? I mean, the Rockies are in the 10,000s. I mean, they're definitely a lot bigger mountains. But the prominence of some of these mountains in the east is equivalent to some of the mountains in the west. I mean, the amount of actual like miles and the elevation that you're gaining over those miles is actually just as intense over here as it is over there. You're just not really dealing with as much of the actual like altitude that you would in
Yeah,
like the
and so
Rockies.
right, and so I've always thought about this when it comes to like the altitude and to the elevation, where if you're because in Boston you're starting a lot in New England, you're starting a lot closer to like sea level.
Hmm.
So even though you might not be like, correct me if I'm wrong, but even though you might not be reaching the same level of like altitude, even though you might not be getting to that same level of elevation, you might end up hiking a higher or a not necessarily higher, but you might end up hiking a more rigorous and a longer hike in an upward direction,
Hmm.
even though it might not be getting to that same like elevation level. And so I've always thought about that, but that's kind of what you're talking about, right, Pat? That even though you might not be like starting at such a high level, the hikes can still be just as rigorous, I would
Yeah,
imagine.
it's pretty much exactly that, right? So I mean, most of the hikes that I tried to do is you're talking about that in the going up stage. It tends to be, oh geez, I can't. It's tough for me to even remember. Probably talking about like a 5 mile or so hike to
Yeah.
get to the summit, right? And
Mhm.
of that 5 mile hike, a lot of the times you're gaining, 2 or 3 thousand feet of elevation, right, on a four
Yeah.
thousand foot
Mhm.
mountain. So I mean, you're climbing a lot of the mountain is really if
Yeah.
you're figuring
Yeah.
what sea
Mhm.
level's at zero, right? And sometime in I mean, I don't have really any experience climbing in the Rockies, so I can't really juxtapose the two. But
Yeah.
my understanding is you're looking at similar elevation gains, right? You're probably talking about similar elevation gains over a similar period of time. It's just instead of starting at, let's say, 1,000 feet above sea level, you're starting at like 8,000 feet above sea
Yeah.
level, right?
Right.
So it's
Exactly.
just that's where you're starting from.
Mhm.
But this goes back to my first backpacking story. So as I said, I had some experience hiking the Whites. Had done a couple of the 4,000 footers, and had decided, I really liked hiking and I really like camping. So why not try and combine the two of them?
Mhm.
So I
Logical line of
yeah,
analysis there. That
exactly, right.
seems to make sense.
And I convinced my sister-in-law and my wife to, go on this kind of adventure with me. I was like, all right, so we all like doing these outdoor things. Let's see if we can let's try our hand at backpacking. So we managed to track down my wife's sister's old backpack. So this is like a backpacking backpack, probably like a 70-liter pack, but it was probably, even at this stage, probably about 20 years old. Maybe a little bit less than that, like 15, but still, this is not
Yeah.
like a new lightweight pack. I mean,
Not a
it
spring
was big. It
chicken in the
was.
world of packs.
Oh,
Yes.
absolutely not. It was large. It was heavy, but it had the capacity to hold what we needed, so that was good. So we had that backpack and then a couple other day packs. So we packed everything into the large backpack, and then I was the one who was carrying that. We strapped on all the sleeping bags like to the other backpacks, so they're just like kind of dangling off the side. And then we used a 3-person like Coleman dome camping tent. So it's the same one that you would use like car camping, and like stuffed it into the backpack, and kind of went from there. So, which, if you know anything about backpacking, we were probably carrying a solid like 5 to 10 pounds more of equipment than we needed to,
Yeah.
in hindsight. But, it was the first time. We had never done it before. So we were, figured let's use what we have and see how it goes. So uh, the trip was going to be up. I don't remember exactly what path it was going to be, but we were hiking up to the Kinsmans. So these are 4,000-foot mountains in the White Mountains, kind of like right near Cannon. So
Yeah.
these
I'm familiar with
peaks,
Canon.
yeah, these
Hmm.
peaks actually run along the same ridge line as Cannon. And if
Okay.
like once you get to the summit of I think North Kinsman, if you walk basically like a mile and a half down the ridge line, you're at like the top of the ski lift for Cannon, more or
Yeah.
less. So it's like that same like elevation gain. But the cool
Yeah.
thing about this hike is that first, you go probably up about a mile and a half, and you reach this like kind of mountainous lake. So there's like this
Okay.
huge lake with like what they call them the AMC huts. So they're on the Appalachian Trail. There's the Appalachian Mountain Club in New Hampshire, and they staff these huts, which are basically areas where you can go and pay like a fee, and then they'll cook you food. You can sleep there overnight, and then you can continue your hike. They're kind of like a little bit more like luxe accommodations for the backwoods, but it also
Yeah.
allows you to not have to carry like a tent and cooking stuff with you as well.
Yeah.
So pretty cool. So we hiked up to this like kind of bigger lake. We stopped into the hut, used the bathroom facilities that they had there, and continued our trip up the mountain. Once we get to the top of the Kinsmans, like right before the summit of the Kinsmans is actually another lake, which is where this tent site is. So
Right.
there's an actual like backpacking tent site there. There's like 3 or 4 platforms where you can like set up your tents, and basically get everything squared away, and you camp there and have a great night. Well, ultimately, we did have a great night. We had a lot of fun. And we were originally planning to, camp that night and then hit the rest of the Cannon Peaks the following day. But
Hmm.
everybody was so sore from from the stuff that we had brought up the mountain that we just
Yeah.
decided, no, we're just gonna make our way back down the mountain and call it a day before anybody gets hurt.
Yeah.
So that was a lot of fun, but
Yeah.
what it did tell us is that um, we need to invest in a little bit better gear.
Yeah.
That
Lighten the
backpack
load a
was
little bit.
good.
Yeah.
It held everything, but at the same time didn't necessarily hold it in the best way. And ultimately, I was holding a lot of things, making it a really heavy load for a really short trip. So that
Yeah.
was definitely a kind of a lessons learned there. On the way back down, I realized that climbing down a mountain with a super heavy pack, not super easy. So I ended
No.
up grabbing like like basically just a stick on the ground that was like big
Yeah.
enough for me to be able to use as a walking stick, and literally
Hmm.
use that for the remainder of the hike down, just to give me another point of contact on the ground. Because
Yeah. That
otherwise,
makes sense.
with that huge pack on your back, anytime you move, it tries to take you out basically. So
Hmm.
that walking
Hmm.
stick becomes pretty critical in that regard. So lessons learned in there was
Yeah.
make sure you have a good quality pack, as well as make sure you don't bring a car camping dome tent up with you, because it's going to be twice as heavy as anything that you can get at a backpacking store. And then walking
Yeah.
sticks are super helpful when you have a big pack.
Yeah, I hadn't kind of considered the importance, especially as you're going down said mountain with the walking stick. Like you always envision like Gandalf from the story of the Lord of the Rings with his like massive staff as he's kind of like trekking across Middle Earth. But kind of the logistical, like the practical uh kind of need for another point of contact, especially as you're trying to like stabilize the bag that's kind of like swooshing back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
is it definitely is kind of like practical enough to need to pick something up off of the good news is that there's plenty of sticks
Yeah,
as
yeah,
you're walking, I would
absolutely.
imagine. So you just got to find one that kind of fits well with what it is that you're trying to do. Let me just ask you, do you think that you kind of like successfully quit while you were ahead, or do you think that you guys had pushed it too much on, like, as a result of, were you guys so sore when you were coming back down the mountain that it was like, yeah, we probably pushed it too much on that first day? Or do you think that you kind of did it right in the sense that you did what you should have on that first day, and then kind of quit while you were ahead and lived to hike another day, for lack of a better phrase?
Yeah, no, I totally think we made the right decision. I think that we were the right amount of sore and tired after
Okay.
that first day. It was more, the idea of packing on additional miles to what we had already done the first day was going to be a
Yeah.
bad idea move, which was originally the plan, right? I mean, personally, when I go hiking, I try and get to as many peaks as I can. So if there's a way
Yeah.
that I can, that I can bag, like, let's say, 4 different peaks on one trip. I mean, that's what I'm gonna try
Yeah.
and do,
Hmm.
right? So, and that's what the strategy was. Now, for the first packing trip, probably a little bit aggressive, having
Yeah.
never done
Uh-huh.
that before. But
Yeah.
we didn't know, so we got the plan squared away, and that we had the option to just go straight down after, which was beneficial in this regard.
Yep. It's almost kind of similar to, like, if you have, and I used to go out to California to my college roommate who lived out in Davis, California, and we would take a trip up to Tahoe and go snowboarding up there, and we'd be there for like the better part of a week. And so it kind of similarly, there was always people that would go, and while I would ski and snowboard while I was kind of like in New England, like my fair amount each year, like when I was out in California, I wanted to make the most of it. And
Hmm.
so the temptation is always like on that first day to get out there and hit the slopes hard while
Hmm.
you're there so that you can make sure that you're making the most of it. But in reality, if you do that and you go too hard on that first day, now you're holed up in bed sore for the remainder, or you're not able to kind of push it the way that you want to for those remaining days. So it's almost kind of like a marathon rather than a sprint type of a situation. But I can remember like pushing through pain in a way that you really only do when you're like college age. When I was out in California, but I see kind of a similar thing going on with your hiking here, Pat, where it's like, if you kind of push it a little bit too much on the earlier side, you don't have you're not able to do as much as you otherwise would have if you kind of like pace yourself a little bit more. So maybe there's a little bit of a lesson in there, to those listening at home, to try and, I guess, pace yourself maybe a little bit, especially when you're early on in kind of like the hiking game, as I know I am, at least, and it sounds like you were in this story, to kind of like make sure that you're not biting off too much more than you can chew. And if you've got big plans, to kind of pace yourself a little bit, I
Yeah,
guess.
no, I mean that's totally true, and I think the thing with the woods is that it can be very unforgiving. I mean, people are
Hmm.
rescued from the White Mountains every year.
Yeah.
That they got to call on the helicopters and get people flown out of
Hmm.
there because they either get lost or broken or they just don't plan well. I mean, there are plenty of people that'll start hiking up a mountain, and then realize that there's a storm coming through, right? And then they're
Yeah.
then they're trapped, and a lot of people do a poor job of bringing everything they need when they go up a mountain. Like, personally, I won't. Every time I leave the car, I prepare myself for the fact that there's a chance that I might be spending the night in the woods. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So it's like you need to bring what you need in order to make that happen, if that's what ends up happening to you, right?
Yeah.
So that those type of realities, I mean, it can become a really scary situation for somebody if you're not prepared. So it
Hmm.
having the information, doing the planning, and making sure you're physically prepared, that the challenge isn't going to be too much for you, as well as mentally prepared, for maybe having to say, I have to turn back now because we're either running out of daylight, the weather
Yeah.
conditions aren't very good, or my body's just not up to the challenge. Thanks for listening to the East Coast Hunt Fish Hike podcast. If you have questions, comments, or have an idea for an episode, feel free to follow us and reach out over social media. Don't forget to rate, review, or tell your friends about the podcast. And until you hear from us again, get outside. Have some fun out there.